We now continue with Smurf.
I'm writing this now because enough time has passed that the details have stopped rearranging themselves in my head every time I think about them. And because I no longer have a badge, a supervisor, or a reason to pretend this is something that can be handled internally. I was an FBI special agent for a little over a decade, assigned to a Midwestern field office that covered a lot of nothing, punctuated by occasional things that mattered. Missing persons cases were part of that workload when there was some hook that made them federal. Things like access, interstate movement, corruption, anything that gave us jurisdiction. Most of them ended the exact same way, quietly, usually with a body found when it was way too late, or sometimes none at all, or with enough evidence to call it voluntary and move on. The case I am talking about did not start any differently to the usual. And that's part of why it took as long as it did for me to understand that what I was dealing with was not just another man who did not want to be found. The initial report came from a county sheriff's office about a deputy who failed to report home after a night shift. I am only going to refer to him by the initial M from now on. He was in his late 30s, he was married, he had 2 kids, he had steady employment and had been an officer for many years. He had no disciplinary write-ups beyond the usual minor stuff. He worked patrol and handled some infrastructure checks because the county had a lot of light industrial sites and utilities that fell under local oversight. His wife reported him missing the next afternoon when he still had not come back and was not answering his phone. The sheriff's office did what they were supposed to do. They checked the local hospitals, they checked the jails, they canvassed the last known area from his cruiser GPS. They even checked the next towns and states over. His vehicle was found parked where it was supposed to be at the end of his shift. There was no signs of a struggle. There was no blood inside the vehicle or outside. There was no damage, no footprints, no signs of a scuffle or anything. His body camera showed a normal night. He signed off at the end of his route, and that was it. We were looped in because he had access to law enforcement databases and mapping systems tied to county infrastructure, and because the sheriff did not like how clean it was. Neither did I at first, but clean is not evidence of anything in itself. I went down to the county the next morning with a local task force officer and sat with M's wife at their kitchen table. She was exhausted but not hysterical, which I've learned not to read into. You can't always tell how a human will react to something as traumatic as this. People grieve and react to trauma in different ways. She told us the same thing that spouses always tell you, that he wouldn't just leave, that they'd had an argument a few days earlier, but nothing serious, that he had been tired lately, but who isn't. The house looked lived in. There were kids' backpacks by the door, dishes in the sink, his boots were left by the couch. Nothing about it suggested someone planning to disappear. I took notes. I asked about his daily routines, about his health, any recent stressors. She mentioned he complained about headaches the week before. I wrote it down without knowing why. We left and did the rest of the legwork. We checked his phone records, his bank activity. We checked his work computer for any signs of anything. Everything stopped when he did. There were no withdrawals taken out. There were no messages, no searches on the computer. There was not even anything in his history that suggested he was making a break for it. It was as if he'd been turned off. 3 days later, while we were still organizing search efforts, M walked into the sheriff's office at the start of a shift like nothing had happened. He was in uniform. He was armed with his state-issued handgun. He logged into his terminal and started filling out paperwork. One of the deputies thought it was a joke until he realized M was not playing along. When the captain pulled him into an office and asked him where he had been, M looked genuinely confused and said he'd taken a personal day and must have forgotten to update the schedule. That answer did not fit the missing persons report his wife had already filed, but it also wasn't insane. People lie badly under stress. The sheriff called us because he did not know what else to do with a man who was both missing and present. I interviewed M that afternoon in a small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning solution. He answered questions calmly. He remembered his childhood, his training, his coworkers. He knew his badge number without checking. These were all just basic checks we were doing to see if he was in the right frame of mind. You know, sometimes the stress gets to you and your brain just cracks. When I asked him about the night he went missing, he said he'd finished his shift. He said he went home, slept, and then came back to work, but this did not add up with what he just said. He said he took a personal day in between, but now he's saying he just came back, like this is just the next day. When I told him, his wife said he had not come home. He did not get angry or defensive. He just looked lost for a second, then said maybe she was mistaken. I asked him to describe his house. He did, accurately, except when he got to the kitchen. He described the layout as it had been before the remodel that had happened months earlier. When I asked him about a scar on his left forearm that showed up in older photos, he looked down at his arm like he'd never really examined it before and said he had never had one. That caught my attention. Scars are things that people remember, especially cops. I noted it and moved on, but I wasn't really sure what I was getting from all of this. I kind of still had no clue what had really happened. His memory was obviously fried, but why? And where did he go? At the end of the interview, he stood up and shook my hand. It's a small thing, but it stuck with me, and I don't even really know why I took note of it. But the grip wasn't weak or crushing at all. It was uniform. It was all pressure at once. It just felt mechanical, not like a human gripping your hand, more like a robot. It felt practiced. I remember thinking that was a strange thought to have and just immediately dismissing it, but it kind of stuck in my mind. I'd shaken a lot of hands in my career. Not all of them felt the same. I left the room thinking I'd just spoken to a man who was under more stress than he realized, and that the truth would come out eventually. Maybe he had something to hide, or maybe he was just really unwell. I didn't get the chance to. 2 days after M returned, a maintenance worker at one of the industrial buildings near the last cell phone ping reported a smell coming from a rented storage unit. Inside was a body in an advanced state of decomposition. Dental records confirmed it was M. The time of death lined up with the night he had vanished. There were no obvious signs of a fight. There were no gunshot wounds. There was no blunt force trauma that could explain it cleanly. The medical examiner's preliminary report used vague language about tissue damage that did not match environmental exposure. That language changed in the final report. By the time I saw it again, it read like any other unattended death. That should have been impossible, though. I had just interviewed him. I had just shaken his hand. There is no way he could have gone back out to the same spot and just died. There is no way he could have been in that state of decomposition in the time since I'd last seen him. The sheriff's office quietly put him on administrative leave and told his wife there had been a mistake, that the body had been misidentified, that the stress had caused some confusion. She didn't really believe them. I don't really know what she believed, but I don't blame her for being so confused. I was told, verbally and without paperwork, that the case was being reassigned. Not closed down, not cleared, but reassigned, which tells me they knew something more, that they had another lead or knew something. 2 people I did not recognize took custody of the body, the storage unit, and M himself. They had credentials, but not ones I could place easily. I was told to remain available if needed. That was it. I didn't really understand. For a few days, nothing happened. Then I was called to a federal facility a couple of hours away and asked to give a statement about my interview. It wasn't internal affairs. It wasn't a prosecutor. It was a group of people who asked me very specific questions about how M spoke, how often he blinked, whether he touched his face while thinking, whether his movements were symmetrical. This call to come here came right from the top. My supervisor himself approved it, told me I needed to go. I answered all the questions honestly, which mostly meant I said I hadn't really noticed. When they asked me about the handshake, I hesitated and then described it as best as I could. One of them nodded like I had confirmed something. Nobody really explained what. Nobody really explained what was going on here, what they were doing here, what they were doing with M, what I was doing here. When I left, I realized I had not been allowed to bring my phone or notes into the room, and that no one had taken a recording. The first time I saw M again after that, it was not in a sheriff's office. It was in a medical room that didn't look like a hospital, but was clean in the same way. He was on a gurney, restrained, conscious. It was in the same facility. He looked at me when I came in, and there was recognition there, but it was thin. Like he knew I was someone he was supposed to know, not someone he actually did. There were bruises on his arms and chest that had not been there before. A technician told me they were from previous attempts. I didn't even ask what that meant. I didn't trust my voice to stay steady if I did. I was told to observe. That was the word they used. Observe and report any discrepancies I noticed. When they administered whatever it was they were giving him, his body reacted violently. This was not a sedated patient going under for surgery. This was some kind of full body convulsion that lifted him off the gurney hard enough that the restraint strained. He made a sound I've never heard a human make. It lasted longer than it should have. When it stopped, he did not breathe for long enough that I thought he was dead. Someone checked his vitals and said something quietly to another person. They didn't cover him. They just adjusted equipment. When he sat up again, I knew immediately that something was wrong, and I also knew this was considered a success from the looks on the faces of the people around me. He looked the same. The face was identical, but there was less behind it. His eyes didn't wander. They fixed on whoever spoke to him, and he stayed there until he was addressed by someone else. He just seemed so empty behind the eyes. He moved and talked like a robot. He didn't really seem human anymore. Ever since I got here, all I could think in my head was, why is he in this facility? Why is he not in a hospital with a medical psychological professional? Like I said, when he moved, it was too fluid. It was efficient with no wasted motion. When they asked him questions, he answered correctly, but without hesitation, without searching his brain. He didn't even have to think for a moment. It was like a computer where you get an instant answer. He didn't complain about restraints or ask where he was. He didn't ask about his wife or kids. He showed no signs of panic when he should have. He was in a completely unfamiliar facility with who knows what being done to him. When I spoke to him, he just acknowledged me with this meek nod, and that was it. I said his name and he responded immediately, like a switch had been flipped, just immediate, all attention on me. I said out loud that this was not the same man I'd interviewed, that there was something wrong. Nobody contradicted me. One of the technicians wrote something down. Another told me that he would be returned to duty once evaluations were complete. Returned. Over the next few weeks, I was brought in again and again, always as an observer, always without paperwork. I was never formally briefed. They didn't have to tell me not to talk. I just knew. The implication was already there, and honestly, who would even believe me? I honestly did not even fully process what I had become involved in until way after the fact. Why they chose to continue my involvement is anyone's guess. Maybe how I handled stress. Maybe how I just did what they asked without question, like a good little agent. I saw M in different settings. Interviews, training exercises, debriefs. Sometimes I saw more than one version in the same building, never in the same room. I started to notice patterns. The versions that had been through more adjustments were flatter. They followed instructions perfectly, but lacked any kind of resistance, even when resistance would have been appropriate. During a simulated arrest scenario, one of them failed to respond to pain cues the way a human should. The evaluator pushed harder, assuming non-compliance. Something broke. His body seized up, and they went still on the mat. The room went quiet, but nobody rushed to help. They waited and watched and confirmed what they already knew. He was removed from the room, and within days, there was another one. I knew it was a different one because it acted differently. It looked differently. Scars and moles and other markers were not in the right place. It was not always a perfect replica. There was always something that just looked a tiny little bit different. I stopped being surprised by the deaths. That is the part I still have trouble with. I started measuring time by iterations instead of days. I would see one version, then not see him again, then see another who looked the same but felt emptier. I would flag issues when asked, and those versions would disappear. I wasn't told what happened to them, but I didn't need to be. The process was efficient. It didn't leave room for sentiment. Again, I had no idea why I was involved. It's not like I knew the guy personally. All I knew is what I learned from the case. Surely someone closer to him would have been a better bet. But I don't know, maybe involving a civilian was too high risk. The justification, when it was finally explained to me in plain language, had nothing to do with M as a person. It was about access and control. His role put him in places and systems that could not afford leaks. They said a human being was a liability. A version of him that could be replaced without legal or ethical fallout was safer. They said he could take on more complex cases, more secretive cases, without worry or fear, with the knowledge that maximum efficiency would be achieved and they could always just send another. I was told this in the same tone someone might use to explain a budget decision. No one framed it as evil, it was practical. I stayed longer than I should have. I told myself I was needed, that if I left, someone else less careful would take my place. That might be true, but eventually it stopped mattering. My performance on the job slipped and I stopped sleeping. I lost a lot of weight. I caught myself staring too long at people's faces, looking for tells that didn't belong. I wondered just how many other times they had tried this before. Just how many fake people they had in the world that they could just replace at a moment's notice. I wonder if the first time M came back was really the first time he came back. There is no way that was the first ever attempt. I was eventually called into a meeting with a doctor and an administrator, and told it would be best I took a medical separation. I signed what they put in front of me. I wasn't threatened, I wasn't followed. There were no people monitoring my house. I was simply removed from the process. I was removed from the FBI, full stop. But they continued to pay me. That was part of the deal. I guess to keep me quiet. I don't know. Like I said, it's been years. I don't know how many M's there are now or if they moved on to other people once the system worked well enough. I think about his wife sometimes and his kids, and which version of him they were given, if any. I'm posting here because there's nowhere else to post it. I survived because I was allowed to leave, that's it. There was no victory, no exposure. I mean, hell, I suppose they could still come after me, but I doubt it. I doubt all these years later anyone would even believe, and I imagine the project is not as primitive now as it was then. I have my doubts. I imagine he was just step one, and I can't even comprehend what they could use it for. I don't even know if this was even voluntary on M's part originally. All I know is that there is no one I can tell this to who wouldn't either laugh in my face, put me in a mental institution, or cause me some serious harm. Hey, hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment because it lets YouTube know you like the content and helps more people to see these videos. My next big goal for the channel is 100,000 subscribers, and as a celebration, I will be doing a Q&A video once we hit that goal. Thank you, and back to the stories. I was a police officer working in southern Jersey when this happened. I started this job when I was 23 years old, and I have been doing it ever since. For the most part, my work is not as thrilling as people imagine it to be. There is not a lot of action in my county, and most days are pretty quiet. The worst calls I usually get are disturbance calls or the occasional shoplifting incident. Sometimes, something more serious happens, but those cases are rare and only occur once in a blue moon. I have worked just about every possible shift that you can think of. I spent my time on the night shift, and I can see that the calls during the night were definitely stranger than the ones during the day. One night, while I was working the night shift, I did not receive any calls at all. I was just cruising down a quiet road with no streetlights and woods on both sides. Suddenly, I saw the reflection of taillights approaching quickly on the right side of the road, on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed that the driver's side door was wide open. I started to veer onto the grass and slowed down, fully planning to get out and see if the driver needed help. I saw someone step out of the car, stand by the door for a moment, and then suddenly run into the woods. I radioed in the codes for a suspicious person or vehicle, then got out of my car with my flashlight and my hand on my holster, just in case. In situations like this, I always have to expect the worst. I walked up to the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see someone else sitting there. The car seemed empty, but there was a seriously foul odor coming from inside. It smelled like a rotting animal, and it was almost overwhelming. I called out to the woods, asking if anybody was there and needed assistance, and I stepped up to the tree line, waving my flashlight around. I went back to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side. There were multiple bloodied tissues and paper towels on the floor of the passenger side, and also on the rear seats. All of the papers were soaked in blood and dark red. While I was looking inside the car, I suddenly heard footsteps coming from inside the woods. I spun around with my flashlight and yelled for whoever was there to come out of the woods. I did not see anyone, but I knew someone was hiding in there, and that was confirmed when I heard a deep voice somewhere beyond the trees and shrubs. I had no idea what the voice said, but I responded by saying, "Show yourself. Are you hurt?" I prepared to unholster my gun as I walked a little bit closer and repeated myself, asking if they were hurt. There was no response at all. The voice I heard before did not sound like someone in pain or bleeding out. Plus, I wondered why someone would run into the woods upon seeing a police car if they needed help. Something about the whole situation felt very off. I went back to the car and requested backup assistance. As I investigated the car further, I noticed it had no license plates. When I checked the rear of the car, I found something that almost made me puke from shock. There was something heavy, wrapped in bloodied paper towels. I put on my gloves and unwrapped it, only to find a severed hand. It took me a moment to realize what it was, because it was completely soaked in dark red blood. The situation instantly escalated from a 5 to a 10. I radioed in that there was a possible murder and that I needed backup immediately. I turned on my cruiser's lights to help the other officers find my location more easily. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods, looking for possible blood trails. We found nothing, not even any blood trails leading from the car. That meant the hand and the blood on the tissues might not have belonged to the person I saw run into the woods. Eventually, the canine unit had arrived and searched for the person. Hours and hours went into the search, well past dawn, but we turned up nothing. The vehicle was taken into custody, and it turned out it had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town. The owner said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. We collected fingerprints from the steering wheel and did DNA testing on the severed hand. There was not a single match to anybody in the database. To this day, there has never been any progress in finding out who the driver of that car was or whose severed hand it was. I used to be a police officer in Seattle, Washington. If I am being completely honest, I never really liked my job as an officer. I never truly wanted to become a police officer in the first place. I only chose the profession because I did not get into any of the colleges that I wanted to attend. I figured that being a police officer would be a decent backup option because I was athletic and physically fit. I had been on multiple high school sports teams, and I continued to go to the gym every day to stay in shape. Every workday felt routine and predictable, and most shifts blended together in my memory. There was one day that did not blend in, and it still stands out sharply in my mind. In October of 2019, I was sitting in my patrol car on duty. I received a call about a man in a park who was holding a hammer and yelling while swinging the hammer at another man. The report said that civilians had tried to intervene and stop the man, but weren't able to do so safely. I decided that I would respond to the call because I was already close to the park at the time. As I drove toward the location, I heard additional radio traffic about a man in a nearby alley holding a flaming stick. I slowed down because the man could have been anywhere in the area and I did not want to miss him. I then saw a man come around a side corner with a stick that was on fire in his hand. I opened my door from a safe distance and shouted, "Seattle Police Department, stop," in a clear, commanding voice. My command did not work at all, and the man cursed at me in response. What happened next was a chain of mistakes that I could have avoided if I had been more careful. I drove my car forward without remembering to close my door properly. I shouted at him again to stop, but he started running straight toward my car while holding the flaming stick. When he reached my vehicle, he threw the burning stick into the car interior through the open door. I immediately jumped across to the passenger seat and fired several shots in his direction in a panicked reaction. None of my shots hit him, and in the chaos, I forgot to hit the brakes to stop the vehicle. The car began rolling backward while I lost my footing and fell partly out of the seat and onto the ground. I got on the radio and dispatched that shots were fired and that I needed immediate medical assistance. I ran away from the car because I could tell that it was about to catch fire completely. Within minutes, other officers reported that they had located the suspect, used a stun gun, and taken him into custody. Hearing that update made me feel relieved because the immediate threat had been contained. Medics arrived at the scene and transported me to a nearby medical center for treatment. I was treated for minor injuries to my left leg and to both of my hands from the incident. While I was still at the medical center, I learned the suspect's name, and I was told that he was charged with assault after being taken into custody by responding officers. About a week after the incident, I was placed on administrative leave as part of standard procedure. After thinking about my life and future, I decided that resigning from the force would be best for me. It still is not clear what started the original argument between the man with the hammer and the other person in the park. Despite moving on, I will never forget the feeling of being trapped inside my own burning vehicle that day. I will also never forget barely making it out with my life after the flaming stick was thrown into my patrol car. I was a state trooper for 25 years, and I thought I had seen everything there was to see in this line of work. There was one night, though, that changed my perspective on what everything really means. It happened quite a few years ago, during one of my regular night patrols on the interstate. The clock read about 4:30 in the morning, and the world was quiet except for the hum of my cruiser's engine. I don't know if you're familiar with the show Cops, but it was a program where cameramen would follow real police officers and film whatever happened during their shifts. The episodes were basically compilations of the most interesting and dramatic moments, and the show was insanely popular back in the day. Unfortunately, new episodes are not made anymore, but back then, I was lucky enough to be featured on the show. Even though I did not appear in many episodes, I still thought it was pretty cool to be part of something so widely watched. On this particular night, I had a cameraman named Joe riding along with me, filming for the show. Joe was a genuinely down-to-earth guy, and we got along well as we cruised through the dark stretches of highway. Normally, I would park my car near some bushes to hide from the view of oncoming speeding cars, but at this hour, I did not bother with stealth. We were just driving down the interstate, talking and scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. The area I worked in was not the best, and there were plenty of abandoned buildings visible from the road. Because of that, I made it part of my nightly routine to check the parking lots of those buildings, since they were hot spots for drug activity. One building in particular was an abandoned gas station, and as the exit for it came up, I decided to check it out. Joe started filming as we pulled into the lot, and we both immediately noticed a flashlight moving around inside the building. I parked the car and watched the beam of light flicker through the windows, almost certain that some kind of drug deal was happening inside. But something felt off. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which was unusual for a deal. I realized if there really was a drug deal, there should have been at least 2 flashlights visible from the outside, not just one. Either way, I knew I had to investigate, so I grabbed the cruiser speaker and called out, announcing myself as police and ordering whoever was inside to come out immediately. As soon as I did that, the flashlight inside switched off and the building fell into an eerie silence. I decided I had no choice but to enter the building and get whoever was inside to leave, so I stepped out of the cruiser and walked toward the wide open front door. Joe followed close behind with his camera, documenting every step. As I approached the entrance, a terrible smell hit me, like an animal had died in there and had been rotting for at least a week. I peeked inside with my own flashlight, once again yelling out, "Police," to make my presence known. The gas station was small, so any sound could be heard from anywhere in the building, and I paused for a moment just to listen. That's when I heard what sounded like something being dragged across the floor from the other side of the building. I called out, "Who's there?" but got no response. I walked deeper into the building, and in one of the back rooms, I saw what looked like a figure standing in the shadows. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the figure, but as soon as the beam hit them, they bolted and ran out for a back exit. I started chasing after the person, but as soon as I exited through the same door, I did not see anything. Almost the whole area was surrounded by a cornfield. There was no way I was going to find this person in the dark, but I figured I had to try, so I ran out in a random direction. After a few seconds I stopped, realizing it was pointless to keep searching in the vast field. Feeling confused and defeated about why the person had run, Joe and I went back to the gas station to see if we could figure out what had happened. What we found left behind in the back room made everything perfectly clear. There, in the shadows, we discovered the lifeless remains of a dead body. I immediately called for backup and explained the situation to dispatch, knowing this was now a crime scene. Unfortunately, the person responsible was never found, and the body itself could not be identified. It was in such a horrible state. For obvious reasons, the footage we caught on video that night was never used in the final cut of the show.